The United Nations top court is preparing to hear South Africa's claims that Israel is committing genocide in its Gaza offensive. In their case brought to the International Court of Justice, South Africa is accusing Israel of acts that are, quote, genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnical group.
There's nothing more atrocious and preposterous than this claim. We will be there at the International Court of Justice and will present proudly our case of using self-defense under our most inherent right under international humanitarian law.
Israel is calling the allegations a despicable and contemptuous exploitation of the court. The U.S. State Department says Washington has not seen, quote, acts that constitute genocide. Canada has so far not put out an official response. Hearings before the International Court of Justice will begin tomorrow, and over the next 2 days, both Israel and South Africa will have 3 hours to make their case. The court will then decide whether it has jurisdiction and if the alleged acts could potentially fall under the scope of the Genocide Treaty. Riaz Sheikh is South Africa's High Commissioner to Canada. High Commissioner, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, David.
It's no small thing to accuse a country of genocide, especially a country like Israel with the history of the Jewish people and everything they've endured on October 7th. How does South Africa justify this allegation?
Well, we have watched what is happening post the 7th of October, and we think that the actions, the military actions and the intentions of the State of Israel constitutes, in our opinion, genocide. And we have brought this application to the World Court on the understanding that Israel, like South Africa and like all the signatories, has an obligation to prevent genocide, and in this case, I think now to stop genocide.
Israel has continuously said they're exercising their right to self-defense. They say that they give advance warning of missile strikes and military action to the population of Gaza that allows them to move, and that anyone intent on committing genocide would not take such actions.
Well, 23,000 by today's count didn't seem to get that message, or didn't seem to get that communication, half of which are children, women, hospitals, schools. So we think that an occupying force, as declared by the United Nations as an occupying force, cannot resort to the claim of self-defense. It has a right to protect. It must exercise that right to protect. It must protect its citizens, and it has a greater obligation to protect the civilians in the occupied territories that they occupy.
What do you mean they can't claim the right to self-defense? Hamas is a designated terrorist organization in this country and in other countries, operating from within Gaza and other places, and it launched these attacks from in there on October 7th. Why does Israel not have a right to respond to that?
We understand that. We understand, yes, there was these attacks. Those attacks were atrocious. As a country, we have condemned those attacks, and we said Hamas should be investigated for war crimes, and it should and it must. But the actions of Hamas is not a justification to continue what we are seeing on a daily basis, which again, in our opinion, constitutes genocide. And the claim of victimization of genocide is not a right to perpetuate that against another people.
So when you say they should stop genocide, does that mean they should stop all military actions inside Gaza, change the way they're conducting their military operations inside Gaza? Because you've heard Prime Minister Netanyahu, members of his cabinet, they are intent on rooting out Hamas as much as they possibly can. And it seems as if their operations will not stop. So is there a way to change the way they conduct things to be in compliance with the standards you're hoping?
Yes, there is. There is a way.
What is that way?
Start negotiations today for the creation of a viable Palestinian state. That is the way. That is the way of peace. That is the way you will have a lasting solution in Israel. To continue your military actions after 23,000 people dead, do you still believe that those actions are right? When is enough enough? When all of Palestine, 1.9, 2.3 million are all killed, is that point enough? No. today it is enough. The world has had enough of this. The peace negotiations for the establishment of a viable Palestinian state must occur immediately.
Who would those negotiations be with? How would you even conduct those negotiations when Hamas, in their own words, on television, has said October 7th was a rehearsal and they will do it again and again and again, and the genocide of the Jewish people is a founding principle of that organization?
Well, to reduce Hamas, to reduce the Palestinians only to Hamas is a mistake.
No, I understand that, and I'm not trying to do that, but
correct.
In there is Hamas with this threat.
I understand it.
Yeah.
Now, we had the same situation where we were told that we cannot have communists amongst ourselves when we were negotiating for our own liberation. And we were very strong that we must not determine for the other side who must constitute their delegation. We must allow the Palestinian people to determine for themselves who will represent them in negotiations. Now, we cannot say, do not be represented. It'll be incorrect for us to say that it is a political party in Canada cannot be elected to the government of Canada. It's just not right.
I understand that, but Hamas, has ruled Gaza through fear and the gun for 15, 16 years. It hasn't had an election since really the first one. And I see no world where Israel and Hamas can sit down at the same table and negotiate. I mean, do you?
I think it's possible. I think now more than ever, we need to redefine the concept of who represents who. We cannot choose others to represent people. Let the people decide for themselves who will represent them. Now, the question of Hamas as a political organization, and it has been a political organization, and it has been accepted in discussions with Israel in the past. In fact, there is the legendary concept that Hamas was in fact created by Israel, but we won't go there. What we will now do is say, let the people of Palestine determine for themselves who will represent them in serious negotiation, and you hold all parties accountable to ensure that they engage in peaceful negotiations for a lasting solution.
I mean, they may have spoken in the past, but it feels like October 7th certainly changed the dynamic, perhaps irreparably, certainly between this government of Israel and Hamas.
David, we had a very similar situation in South Africa on the eve of our negotiations, where a massacre occurred, where hundreds, if not thousands of people were killed. We knew that if we allowed that to derail the negotiations, there would be no peace in South Africa. So those who wish to negotiate must be quite aware that there will be forces that will derail such negotiations. But we should not be detracted by that. That should be an impetus to continue down the path of negotiations.
You mentioned off the top that Israel is a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and you would expect them to comply with any finding by the World Court, the ICJ. South Africa is a signatory to the Rome Statutes, and your country has been criticized for not complying with orders for the International Criminal Court. In 2015, Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese dictator, was in your country. There was no arrests made despite warrants being out. The last time we spoke, we discussed the warrants against Vladimir Putin for what's happening in Ukraine. Is there a credibility issue there with the global community of South Africa when you haven't lived up to your obligations under other international legal court requirements and now taking this action against Israel?
David, let's just say this. We have acted consistently. We have acted consistently to all our obligations. To the extent that we may have taken missteps, now in the case of Bashir, he left South Africa before the warrant was executed. So it was not that there was no intention to execute the warrant. He left before it was executed, and the criticism has been that we should not have allowed him to leave. That's the first. On the second, we have stated our matter in regard to Putin when we discussed the last time. He did not come to South Africa, so there was no legitimate basis to execute a warrant of arrest. So we believe we have acted consistently. But the more important point of the consistency is that A, we say all matters must be resolved by the United Nations in the spirit of multilateralism so that we could live in peace.
What is the value, though, of a finding from the ICJ? Say the World Court does decide that you're right and this is genocide by the Israeli government. They also issued a finding ordering Vladimir Putin to stop his aggression in Ukraine, and that has been completely and utterly ignored. I mean, what is the value of this in terms of its enforceability? Because it falls to the UN Security Council to enforce the findings of this court. And as you're well aware, that is so divided, certainly in terms of the sides that the permanent members are taking. Vetoes stop any kind of resolution or meaningful action by the UN on a lot of these things. So what would be the value of this finding should you get it?
Well, firstly, just on the finding itself, we don't think that by tomorrow, the day after, or by end of the month, that the court will rule a finding on genocide. We think that will take a considerable amount of time. But what's more important is that there will be a declaration on our interim measures that we are asking for, the provisional measures. And the provisional measures will bind all parties. It'll place obligations on South Africa as well, but it'll bring the obligation on Israel, the state of Israel, to desist from any further action, genocidal action. It'll mean the cessation of hostilities, and included in the interim measures will be humanitarian assistance, which we can all agree is needed desperately in Palestine today.
But the enforceability of that, I mean,
Yes.
Russia has not stopped hostilities. You know, we're about to enter a third year of that war.
Yes, which is, again, as we've said, unfortunate, and we said the sooner that negotiations to bring that conflict to an end starts, the better for everyone. And here we would think that once and we hope, we don't know for certain, but we hope that the declaration will be given on our provisional measures. It gives a furtherance of international law. It gives a furtherance for all of us to rally behind international law and to bring about the humanitarian ceasefire that we are all asking for.
Riaz Sheikh, South Africa's High Commissioner to Canada. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, David.
Erwin Kotler is a former Justice Minister and Attorney General and Canada's former Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism. Mr. Kotler, welcome back to the show.
Good to speak with you.
I spoke to the South African High Commissioner earlier in the show, and he said that the actions of Hamas is not a justification to continue what we're seeing on a daily basis in Gaza by the Israeli military, and that's what constitutes genocide. What do you make of this case put forward by South Africa?
Well, genocide as the crime of crimes, the ultimate crime against humanity, and this Israel-Hamas war began on October 7th. And unless that is appreciated, then the whole context is lost. And on October 7th, we witnessed a criminal invasion, active aggression against the civilian population of Israel, accompanied by war crimes and crimes against humanity, and arguably also acts constitutive of genocide. And it's not surprising because Hamas is not only a terrorist organization, it's a terrorist government governing the Gaza Strip, repressing both its own people as well as targeting civilians. And it not only committed atrocities too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened, but it's all anchored in its standing incitement to genocide, itself a standing breach of the Genocide Convention. In other words, its own charter calls, which from 1988, its founding calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. So it's a kind of Orwellian situation, an inversion of fact and law to charge the country that is exercising its rightful obligation to self-defense, itself sanctioned under Article 51 of the UN Charter, to put an allegation of genocide against that country when it was the victim of acts of genocide and the target of standing incitement to genocide all these years. So I can't understand really the South Africa's weaponization, in effect, of international law, which not only ends up being defamatory of Israel, not only incentivizing anti-Semitism, but effectively undermining the whole rules-based international legal order and the ICJ itself.
And the High Commissioner, Mr. Sheikh, he did say that he thought what Hamas did was a war crime and has called for them to be investigated by the International Criminal Court, which is separate from this because it deals with non-state actors and individuals, as you well know. But he makes the point that in South Africa's view, what happened after October 7th by Israel and continues by Israel violates the genocide conventions, and that's why they've gone to the World Court through the UN. Are you concerned the possibility that South Africa could win there and this judgment be rendered against Israel?
I mean, I don't in any way discount the horrific and catastrophic devastation that has taken place in Gaza, and one has to mourn the death of any innocent civilian, be they Palestinian or Israeli. But the problem here is, whereas Israel has sought to minimize civilian casualties in the exercise of its right to self-defense, and if in fact there have been any breaches of international human rights and humanitarian law in that regard, then the ICC is the proper forum for that kind of accountability. But to go ahead and to impugn an entire state with the most horrific crime of crimes, namely the crime of genocide, is to turn fact and law on its head, because while Israel seeks to minimize casualties, Hamas, in effect, maximizes casualties through its use of Gazans as human shields, through its storage and firing of weapons from civilian infrastructure, including using hospitals, including mosques, including even UNRWA centers for storage of weapons and firing of rockets, and the firing of rockets themselves constituting war crimes. So Hamas almost invites that kind of devastation at the expense of its own people in order to then go ahead and make these false charges of genocide so as to demonize Israel and the Jewish state in the international community and the court of public opinion.
I wonder, you said at the beginning of that answer you don't discount the devastation and the loss of life in Gaza, which has been quite severe as it is in war. We have heard from the President of the United States, Antony Blinken. They have concerns, despite prior notice and the dropping of leaflets and other things by the Israeli military, that they still want to see more precautions taken to protect civilian life. And this week we heard the UK Foreign Minister David Cameron say that he has some concern that Israel may have violated international law. Do you think that is a possibility, that Israel may have broken international law in the way it's conducted this war, well, even if it's not genocide, as South Africa says?
I read Secretary of State Blinken's statement and his full statement, and he said that, yes, there's been suffering in Gaza, but the suffering is as a result of Hamas's attack and criminal aggression of October 7th. And then he added a very important point. He said, that was bad enough. But if on October 8th, if Hamas had returned the hostages, had surrendered its weapons and its leadership, that would have been the end of the story. That then would have already been a ceasefire then, and we would not have witnessed the horrific, catastrophic events that we've seen since then. So Hamas bears responsibility not only for its war crimes and crimes against humanity and acts of genocide of October 7th, but for not doing anything after October 7th. In fact, it continued to fire rockets and engage in the war crimes that I was referencing even after October 7th.
The High Commissioner suggested that the way for this to end is to immediately start peace talks towards a two-state solution, and suggested that could even mean having Hamas at the table if that's who the Palestinian people choose to be their representative in such a process. Is that a viable option as far as you're concerned, given what happened on October 7th, given the comments by its leadership since then that it would launch further attacks of that nature. And as you pointed out, it's founding principle for the elimination of the Israeli state. Could there be a negotiation involving Hamas?
I mean, Hamas has also stated after October 7th in interviews by its leadership that it will engage in October 7th acts of atrocity again and again. So how one can enter into peace negotiations with a group, a terrorist group that is by its own acknowledgement a genocidal anti-Semitic terrorist group committed to the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. This is not a recipe for peace. This is an indulgence of impunity and criminality. I've been a long time supporter and remain so of a two-state solution. But a two-state solution presupposes the mutual acknowledgement and recognition of each other's legitimacy. And so while Israel has been prepared to accept the legitimacy of Palestinian rights, Hamas not only does not respect the legitimacy of a Jewish state, but is committed to the destruction of that state. So I don't see how they could be a legitimate partner for a peace that we should all seek to strive for, both the Israeli and Palestinian people. And as I said, Hamas is not only an enemy of Israel, it's an enemy of the Palestinian people. It not only holds Israeli hostage, it holds the Palestinian hostage. And therefore, if we seek peace, Hamas is not the route to that peace.
One final question for you, sir. The High Commissioner said today at its press conference, and referenced it in our interview, that a lot of people in South Africa, there has been a solidarity with the Palestinians going back to the apartheid days in his country, and they see, a commonality between the struggles of the two people. I know you were a witness to the apartheid state in South Africa. You were part of Nelson Mandela's international legal team when he was imprisoned by the South African government. From your perspective, what do you make of that comparison of the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa to what is happening in Israel and Gaza right now?
I think it's a false analogy. Somebody who was arrested myself in 1981 in South Africa for giving a speech called "If Not Sharansky, Why Not Mandela," and who met with Mandela and Mandela's own position. And he was very supportive of Palestinian rights, that should be clear, very supportive of the self-determination of the Palestinian people. But he also said, and this should not be ignored, that Israel has a right to live within a secure and recognized boundaries, as set forth in UN Security Council Resolution 242. So Mandela would not support, I'm sure, a genocide charge against Israel. He also accepted an honorary doctorate from an Israeli university, Ben Gurion University, which we both shared and spoke about that as well. So Mandela was committed to two states for two peoples. I don't think he would see Hamas as a possible interlocutor in that regard. He would say Hamas should be held accountable for its crimes, not have its criminality indulged and validated. And so he would work towards a two-state solution, but certainly would eschew any relationship with Hamas and would seek to have them held accountable.
Erwin Kottler, former Justice Minister and Attorney General, thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Good speaking with you.